Welcome to our deep dive into the world of smart decline.
Smart decline.
Yeah, smart decline.
Yeah.
So it's how cities are planning for a future with shrinking populations.
Ah, okay.
You've shared some research on this, and you're especially curious about whether these initiatives can be implemented fairly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question,
Yeah.
especially as cities are changing so rapidly.
Right.
Um, and the resources are limited,
Mm.
so making sure things are done justly
Yeah,
is really important.
absolutely. And we're zeroing in on Baltimore
Okay.
and their abandoned housing strategy using this in-depth article you've provided.
Yeah, this is a fascinating case study
Mhm.
because for decades, cities just assumed growth was a given.
Right, just build, build, build.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Baltimore's lost a staggering 32% of its population
Wow.
between 1970 and 2016.
That's a lot of people.
It is, and it leaves behind a vast landscape of vacant properties.
So the question becomes, can a city deal with this scale of challenge while ensuring things are done justly for everyone?
Right. It's a huge question.
Yeah, let's set the stage by going back in time a little bit.
Okay.
The article highlights some key historical points about Baltimore's decline.
Yeah. It's trajectory many post-industrial cities had experienced.
Mm.
After World War II, Baltimore's manufacturing-based economy shifted
Okay.
and suburbs beckoned.
Yeah,
So this broke the once tight link between where people lived and worked.
right. So no longer did you have to live right down the street from the factory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People had more options.
Okay.
And so that started to change the dynamics of the city.
And those iconic Baltimore row houses,
Ah, yes.
symbols of stability for working and middle-class families,
Great.
began this downward spiral.
They did.
They often ended up owned by absentee landlords who didn't invest in keeping them up.
Precisely. And as those properties fell into disrepair,
Yeah,
it just kind of created a snowball effect.
right.
Some neighborhoods saw poverty and crime increase, leading to further exodus. And this created a vicious cycle that contributed to the vacancy crisis they're grappling with today.
So they basically have tons of empty houses.
Tons.
And
It's a real challenge.
So how has Baltimore tried to address this?
Well, they have this thing called the abandoned housing strategy,
Okay.
and it seems to have evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
They've employed a range of approaches. Early on, there was a big focus on master planning. So, big picture thinking
Yeah.
with initiatives like Plan Baltimore.
In Baltimore?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this aimed to tackle plight,
Okay.
develop neighborhood-specific strategies, and also target certain areas for demolition to make way for new development.
So kind of clearing the slate a little bit.
In a way, yeah.
They also tried to boost home ownership
Mm-hmm.
through programs like the Dollar House Program
The Dollar House Program.
and Rehab Express.
Rehab Express. So these were attempts to...
Get people into the houses.
Yes, exactly.
I'm guessing selling houses for $1 had some appeal.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But these programs, while initially popular,
Mm-hmm.
weren't sustainable in the long term.
So what was the issue there?
Well, they required substantial city subsidies.
Ah, so you can't just keep selling houses for $1.
Not if you want to keep the lights on.
Right.
Another approach involved streamlining property acquisition,
Oh.
making it easier for the city to take control of these vacant properties.
Mm.
This included things like quick take authority.
Quick take authority.
Yeah, it's a controversial policy that allows the city to more easily condemn and take possession of abandoned properties, even if the owners objected.
Wow. That sounds like it could be pretty contentious,
It definitely was.
especially depending on how it was applied.
Absolutely. And there was also this massive initiative to just acquire as many vacant properties as possible.
Was that called Project 5000?
Yes, Project 5000 aimed to acquire 5,000 abandoned properties.
That's ambitious.
It was very ambitious.
In just 2 years.
And they actually exceeded that goal.
Wow.
They acquired 6,000.
So then the question becomes, what do you do with all these properties?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Demolition was a significant part of the strategy,
Okay.
but early efforts were criticized for being haphazard.
Okay.
They were just kind of tearing things down without a clear plan.
Just reacting to the immediate problem.
Exactly, and that led to some unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, some of the demolitions ended up causing more problems.
Really?
The article mentions that it actually destabilized some of the remaining structures
Oh, wow.
and created these strange gaps in the urban fabric.
So it kind of backfired a little bit.
It did.
All right.
So they had to rethink their approach.
So what did that look like?
So instead of these scattered demolitions, they started focusing on whole block demolitions in areas with extremely high vacancy rates.
I see.
The idea was to create a blank slate for redevelopment.
Okay.
But of course, that raises questions about what kind of redevelopment.
Right, and who benefits?
Yeah.
Because we can't talk about Baltimore's efforts without mentioning the Inner Harbor revitalization.
Inner Harbor, yeah.
It's a huge success story, bringing in tourism and revenue.
It is a very different story from the East Baltimore Development Inc. project, or EBD.
EBD,
This involved relocating over 700 families,
700 families.
the vast majority being Black residents, to make way for redevelopment.
So that immediately raises concerns about displacement and who ultimately benefits from these large-scale projects.
Right, and it highlights those issues of justice and equity that we're really interested in exploring.
Absolutely. Did Baltimore explore any alternatives to just demolition?
They did.
Okay.
In fact, Baltimore has been quite innovative in their use of vacant land. They've implemented urban greening and sustainability initiatives, transforming empty lots into urban farms and green spaces.
Like community gardens?
Yeah, like community gardens, parks, that kind of thing.
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Programs like Homegrown Baltimore. And the Growing Green initiative, where they turn vacant properties into green spaces.
It's a really positive way to utilize these spaces.
It does seem like a much better alternative than just tearing everything down.
Absolutely. And it's a good example of thinking beyond traditional approaches to urban planning. They've also developed tools like the housing market typology.
Housing market typology?
Which helps them categorize neighborhoods based on market conditions,
Okay.
allowing them to allocate resources more strategically.
So it sounds like they're trying to be more targeted in their approach, not just reacting to vacancy in a piecemeal way.
That's right. The latest iteration of their strategy is the Vacants to Value program, or V2V.
BOV.
It utilizes a 7-point strategy for addressing vacancy.
So kind of a more comprehensive approach.
Yes, much more comprehensive and data-driven.
Okay. So we've got this overview of Baltimore strategies, but let's get to the heart of what you're really interested in.
Okay.
How these strategies measure up against principles of justice.
Now we're talking, this is where things get particularly interesting.
Okay.
The article we're looking at evaluates Baltimore's approach based on 5 key propositions for what constitutes a just planning process in a shrinking city.
5 propositions.
Yep.
Okay, what are they?
Inclusion,
Okay.
deliberation, recognition,
Okay.
transparency, and scale appropriateness.
Those are some pretty hefty concepts.
They are, but they're essential for understanding whether smart decline is truly just.
Let's unpack those one by one, starting with inclusion.
Right.
What does that actually look like in a city trying to implement smart decline?
Well, on the surface, it seems like Baltimore has made efforts to incorporate multiple voices. They've held public meetings, conducted outreach efforts, and developed programs specifically targeted at helping residents in disadvantaged neighborhoods revitalize vacant lots.
But I'm sensing a but coming.
There's always a but, isn't there? The article highlights a crucial point when it came to the Growing Green Initiative's decision-making process.
Okay.
Community leaders were actually excluded from the key planning meetings.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Why would they exclude the very people who are most impacted by these decisions?
The rationale was that it involved technical information, best left to the experts.
So they thought residents wouldn't understand.
I think there was a sense that it was too complex.
But that raises questions about whether genuine inclusion is truly valued.
Right.
Or if it's sometimes treated as a box to be ticked.
Unfortunately, I think that's a common problem.
So even though they were including residents in some aspects, there were still decisions being made behind closed doors.
Yes, and that doesn't seem very just or transparent.
And that leads us directly to the next proposition.
Deliberation.
Deliberation.
The city's approach has been criticized for being very top-down.
Top-down, how so?
They often present the abandoned housing strategy as a purely technical solution, which limits opportunities for open debate and contestation from the community.
So rather than having a real dialogue with residents about what they want for their neighborhoods, the city is calling the shots.
That's been the case in several instances.
Yep.
We can see this clearly in the EBDI project with its relocation of hundreds of families.
Right.
While the city argued they provided residents with choices, the reality is many felt forced out of their homes.
That raises concerns about whether those choices were truly free and fair.
Absolutely.
Especially considering the power imbalances between the city and those residents.
And this gets to the core of the third proposition, recognition.
Recognition.
While the city disseminates information about its plans,
Okay.
it doesn't do much to help residents understand and challenge the existing power dynamics in Baltimore.
So it's not enough to just provide information.
No.
You have to equip residents to use that information to advocate for themselves
Yeah.
and hold the city accountable.
Exactly, especially in a city with Baltimore's history of racial segregation and discrimination.
Right.
These power dynamics are deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
The city needs to actively address them, not simply gloss over them.
Okay, 2 more propositions to go.
We're getting there.
What about transparency? How open is Baltimore about its decision-making process?
This is where things get a bit complicated.
Okay.
Baltimore has shown a willingness to use data and analytical approaches,
Okay.
which on the surface suggests transparency.
So they're at least trying to be data-driven and analytical in their approach?
They are, but when researchers interviewed city officials about the demolition process, a lack of clarity emerged.
Oh.
The officials admitted that there weren't clearly defined goals and objectives driving the demolition decisions.
So even if they're using fancy models and data, if the underlying goals are unclear, it's hard to know if the outcomes are actually just...
You're absolutely right, and that lack of transparency makes it difficult for residents to understand why certain decisions are being made and to hold the city accountable.
Right. Last but not least, scale appropriateness.
Scale appropriateness.
What does that even mean in this context?
It's about recognizing that shrinking cities don't exist in isolation.
Okay.
The issues they face are often regional in scope.
So things like population loss, economic shifts, environmental concerns, these things extend beyond city limits.
Exactly. So smart decline can't just be a city-centric approach.
You have to consider the broader regional context.
Precisely. And this proposition argues that just planning processes should involve collaboration across those regional boundaries.
Makes sense. So how does Baltimore measure up in that regard?
Surprisingly, not very well.
Really?
The article points out that there's minimal formal collaboration between Baltimore's abandoned housing strategy and the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, which is the regional planning body.
That's unexpected.
Yeah.
It seems like a huge missed opportunity to address these challenges more holistically.
It is issues like transportation, environmental concerns, and economic development all transcend city boundaries.
Right.
Addressing them effectively requires a regional approach.
Okay, so we've got this historical context of Baltimore's decline,
Right.
a rundown of their various strategies for dealing with abandoned housing, and an initial analysis of how those strategies measure up against principles of justice.
It's a lot to take in.
It's a pretty mixed bag so far.
It is, and the article doesn't shy away from highlighting some of the criticisms of Baltimore's approach.
Okay.
Want to delve into those a bit more?
Absolutely. Let's explore those critiques and see what lessons can be learned from them.
Let's dig into some of those criticisms leveled against Baltimore's abandoned housing strategy. One of the most prominent is that early demolition efforts were often piecemeal and, as we touched on before, counterproductive.
Right. It seemed like they were just reacting to the immediate problem of vacant houses without a cohesive plan.
And that lack of a comprehensive strategy led to some unintended consequences. Remember how those scattered demolitions ended up causing more problems?
Yes, the article mentioned that it actually destabilized some of the remaining structures and created these strange gaps in the urban fabric.
Precisely. Not only was it visually jarring, but it also raised concerns about safety and the long-term viability of those neighborhoods. Residents also voiced concerns about environmental hazards from the demolitions.
What kind of hazards?
Things like lead paint and asbestos being released into the air and soil during demolition. These are serious health risks, particularly for children and vulnerable populations, and there were complaints about a lack of community involvement in the process, which further fueled distrust and resentment.
Which again circles back to those issues of justice and equity that we've been discussing. If residents aren't being consulted or informed about decisions that directly impact their health and well-being, it creates a sense of powerlessness and injustice.
Absolutely, and it speaks to the need for a more inclusive and deliberative approach to smart decline planning. Baltimore also faces a persistent challenge familiar to many cities, balancing the need for strategic resource allocation with the political necessity of distributing funds equitably.
It's a tough balancing act, no doubt. You want to make sure that resources are being used effectively to revitalize neighborhoods and create opportunities, but you also don't want to leave entire communities behind.
Exactly. There's a constant tension between targeting resources to areas where they might have the biggest impact and ensuring that all neighborhoods receive a fair share. And in shrinking cities where resources are often limited, these tensions can be even more pronounced.
So it seems like Baltimore's approach has been marked by a series of fits and starts, some innovative ideas, but also some missteps and persistent challenges when it comes to incorporating those five propositions for just planning.
That's a fair assessment, and I think it highlights the complexity of smart decline. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, and even well-intentioned efforts can have unintended consequences.
But the article doesn't simply critique Baltimore's approach. It also delves deeper into those five propositions, offering a framework for how shrinking cities can strive for more just and equitable outcomes.
Right. It's not enough to just acknowledge that these principles are important. We need to understand what they look like in practice and how they can be applied to real-world planning processes.
So let's revisit those five propositions, starting with inclusion. What does it mean to truly include residents in smart decline planning?
True inclusion goes beyond simply inviting people to a public meeting or hosting a community forum. It's about actively seeking out and valuing the voices of all residents, especially those who have been historically marginalized or excluded from decision-making processes.
That makes sense. So how can cities ensure that those voices are not only heard, but also genuinely considered?
That's where deliberation comes in. It's about creating spaces where residents feel safe to share their concerns, ask tough questions, and challenge the status quo. A truly deliberative process allows for open and honest discussion even when there are disagreements.
So it's not just about getting people in the room. It's about fostering an environment where they feel comfortable expressing their perspectives and engaging in meaningful dialogue.
Exactly, and this requires a shift from a top-down approach to a more collaborative and participatory model.
Yeah.
Cities need to be willing to share power and decision-making authority with residents.
That seems crucial, especially when we're talking about issues like relocation and displacement, which are incredibly sensitive and deeply personal.
Absolutely. We saw how the lack of deliberation in the EDDI project created a sense of distrust and resentment among residents. They felt like their voices weren't being heard and that their needs weren't being considered.
So deliberation is essential for building trust and ensuring that residents feel like they have a genuine stake in the process. What about recognition? How does that factor into just planning?
Recognition is about acknowledging and addressing the power imbalances that exist within a city. It's about understanding the historical and systemic factors that have led to certain neighborhoods being disadvantaged or marginalized.
So in Baltimore's case, it would involve acknowledging the city's long history of racial segregation and how that has shaped the current landscape of vacancy and decline.
Precisely, and it's not just about acknowledging those power dynamics, it's about actively working to dismantle them. This might involve things like prioritizing investment in historically under-resourced neighborhoods, ensuring that development benefits are distributed equitably, and creating opportunities for residents to build wealth and ownership in their communities.
So it's about creating a more level playing field and empowering residents to shape their own destinies.
Exactly. And that requires a fundamental shift in how we think about power and decision making. It's about moving away from a top-down model and embracing a more collaborative and participatory approach.
Which brings us back to the importance of transparency.
Transparency is crucial for building trust and accountability. It's about being open and honest about the challenges facing the city, the decisions being made, and the reasons behind those decisions.
So no more hiding behind technical jargon or bureaucratic processes.
Exactly. Information needs to be shared in a way that's accessible and understandable to everyone, and cities need to be willing to answer tough questions and be held accountable for their actions.
That seems particularly important when we're talking about things like demolition, which can have such a profound impact on communities.
Absolutely. We saw how the lack of transparency in Baltimore's demolition process led to distrust and suspicion among residents. They didn't understand why certain properties were being demolished and others weren't, and they felt like their concerns weren't being taken seriously.
So transparency is essential for ensuring that residents feel like they're being treated fairly and that their voices are being heard.
Precisely, and it's also crucial for holding city officials accountable and ensuring that decisions are being made in the best interests of the community as a whole.
Okay, we've covered inclusion, deliberation, recognition, and transparency.
hmm
What about the last proposition, scale appropriateness? Why is it so important to consider the regional context when planning for shrinking cities?
Because shrinking cities don't exist in a vacuum, the forces that drive decline, things like suburbanization, economic shifts, and changing demographics, are often regional in scope.
So to effectively address those issues, you have to think beyond the city limits.
Exactly. A regional approach might involve things like collaborating with surrounding municipalities on transportation planning, coordinating economic development strategies, or sharing resources to address issues like affordable housing and environmental protection.
And that's where Baltimore fell short,
Hmm.
right? By not partnering with the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, they missed an opportunity to tackle these challenges more effectively.
You're right, it's a common pitfall for shrinking cities to focus inward and neglect the importance of regional collaboration, but the reality is that these issues don't respect municipal boundaries.
So it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of these challenges
Mm.
and finding solutions that benefit everyone, not just those within the city limits.
Absolutely, and that requires a shift in thinking from a competitive mindset to a more collaborative and cooperative one.
That's a great point. It's easy to fall into the trap of seeing neighboring municipalities as rivals rather than potential partners. But in the context of smart decline, collaboration is key.
Exactly. We need to move away from the zero-sum game mentality and embrace a more holistic and integrated approach to regional planning.
Okay, we've revisited those 5 propositions for just planning and explored how they apply to the challenges facing shrinking cities. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to a point you made earlier about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned efforts. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure, I think it's important to recognize that even when cities are striving to do the right thing, there can be unintended consequences, especially when it comes to complex issues like smart decline.
Can you give me an example?
Well, let's consider the demolition of vacant properties on the surface. It seems like a logical solution to address blight and make way for new development. But as we've seen in Baltimore, if it's not done carefully and thoughtfully, it can lead to environmental hazards, displacement, and further destabilization of neighborhoods.
So it's not just about tearing down buildings, it's about understanding the ripple effects of those actions and mitigating the potential negative impacts.
Exactly. And this requires a deep understanding of the community, its history, its needs, and its aspirations. It also requires a willingness to listen to residents, incorporate their feedback, and adjust course when necessary.
That makes sense. So it's about being proactive rather than reactive. And it's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges of smart decline.
Precisely. Every city is unique, and every community has its own set of circumstances and priorities. There's no magic formula, and the most effective solutions will be those that are tailored to the specific context.
So what are some key takeaways for cities that are grappling with these issues? What can they learn from Baltimore's experience, both the successes and the shortcomings?
I think there are several valuable lessons to be learned. First, it's crucial to engage residents early and often in the planning process. Don't just inform them of decisions that have already been made, involve them in shaping the vision and the strategies for their neighborhoods.
So it's about empowering residents and giving them a real voice in shaping their own destinies.
Exactly. Second, be transparent about the challenges facing the city and the decisions being made. Share information in a clear and accessible way, and be willing to answer tough questions.
That builds trust and accountability.
It does, third, recognize that shrinking cities don't exist in isolation. Collaborate with surrounding regions to address shared challenges and find solutions that benefit everyone.
So it's about thinking regionally and recognizing the interconnectedness of these issues.
Right, and finally remember that smart decline is not just about managing shrinkage, it's about creating thriving, resilient communities.
That's a great point. It's about investing in things like affordable housing, quality education, accessible healthcare, and vibrant public spaces.
Exactly. It's about creating opportunities for economic development that benefit all residents, not just a select few.
So it's about recognizing that smart decline is not just about shrinking, it's about transforming. It's about creating a different kind of future one that's more just equitable and sustainable.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that's a future worth striving for.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I'm curious to hear the author's concluding thoughts on these complex issues. What are their final takeaways for Baltimore and for other shrinking cities?
That's a great question, and I think their conclusion offers a powerful challenge, not just to Baltimore, but to all shrinking cities.
Let's hear what's the challenge.
To move beyond simply planning for decline, to actually planning for justice in decline, to ensure that these initiatives are not just about managing shrinkage, but about creating a more equitable and vibrant future for all residents.
That's a powerful message.
It is, and it's a call to action for all of us.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive and leave our listener with some final thoughts and perhaps some inspiration for further exploration. That challenge to plan for justice in decline really resonates. We've unpacked Baltimore's approach with its mix of successes and areas where they could have done better. But what about other shrinking cities? What concrete steps can they take to ensure justice is at the forefront?
There's no single blueprint, but we can distill some key insights from everything we've discussed. First and foremost, genuine community engagement is non-negotiable. It can't be an afterthought or a box to be ticked. Residents need to be true partners involved from the very beginning, shaping the vision and strategies for their neighborhoods.
So not just being informed, but actively shaping the direction things take.
Exactly. And that engagement needs to be inclusive, reaching out to those who've historically been excluded from these processes, providing resources and support so everyone can participate meaningfully.
And that ties back to deliberation, making sure there's space for open and honest discussion, even when there are disagreements.
Right. It's about fostering an environment where residents feel safe to share their concerns, challenge the status quo, and hold decision makers accountable. This requires a fundamental shift from a top-down approach to a more collaborative and participatory model.
Which makes transparency even more vital.
Yeah.
Cities can't just say they're doing things justly, they need to show it.
Absolutely. Transparency means being open about the challenges, the decisions being made, and the reasons behind those decisions. Information needs to be readily available and understandable to everyone, not hidden behind technical jargon or bureaucratic processes.
It seems like this level of transparency could be a game changer in building trust between residents and city officials, especially when dealing with potentially sensitive issues like demolition or relocation.
You're right. When people understand why decisions are being made, even if they don't agree with them, it can go a long way in fostering a sense of fairness.
Yeah.
It also allows residents to hold their leaders accountable and advocate for their needs more effectively.
Speaking of advocating, one thing that struck me was how often shrinking cities seem to focus inward, overlooking the importance of regional collaboration.
It's a common trap, but as we've seen, these issues rarely stay within city limits. Population loss, economic shifts, environmental concerns, they all transcend those boundaries. Smart decline requires thinking regionally.
So collaborating with neighboring municipalities on things like transportation, economic development, even sharing resources to address shared challenges.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that what benefits one community often benefits the region as a whole. This kind of collaboration can lead to more innovative and sustainable solutions, and it fosters a sense of shared responsibility for the future.
So we've got community engagement, deliberation, transparency, and regional collaboration. What's the final piece of the puzzle when it comes to ensuring justice in shrinking cities?
I think it comes down to a fundamental shift in perspective. Smart decline shouldn't just be about managing shrinkage, it should be about creating thriving, resilient communities.
So moving beyond a purely reactive approach and focusing on a vision for the future that prioritizes the well-being of all residents.
Precisely. This means investing in things that truly matter. Affordable housing, quality education, accessible healthcare, vibrant public spaces. It's about creating opportunities for economic development that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
It's about recognizing that decline doesn't have to mean decay. It can be an opportunity to reinvent, to create a different kind of future one that's more equitable, sustainable, and vibrant.
You've captured it perfectly. Smart decline, when done right, can be a catalyst for positive transformation. It's about recognizing that less can be more, that a smaller footprint can actually lead to a stronger, more connected, and more resilient community.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. We've explored the complexities of smart decline, the challenges and opportunities it presents, and most importantly, how cities can strive for justice in this process.
It's a conversation that needs to continue not just in shrinking cities, but in all communities facing change.
And it's a conversation that we all have a role in, as residents, as advocates, as decision makers. We all have a responsibility to ensure that decline doesn't equate to disinvestment or disregard for the well-being of our communities.
I couldn't agree more. The future of our cities depends on it.
Well, on that note, we want to leave you, our listener, with one final thought. Don't just accept the narrative of decline challenge. Get involved. Advocate for the kind of future you want to see for your community. And remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect, contributing to a more just and equitable future for all.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has sparked some new ideas and inspired you to be a part of shaping the future of your city.